Hello, my name's Freddy. I'm the deputy editor of The Spectator, and I tend to bore on about American politics. So that's why I've been asked to do this, I think. I would like to thank Legatum for organising this event, and also for setting up the Special Relationship Unit, which is, I think, very well timed, given that we have a US election and a UK election coming up, and things are in flux. I think it's no secret that the first Trump administration, as far as Britain's concerned, we missed a golden opportunity diplomatically. The Trump administration was very well disposed towards Brexit, was very well disposed towards Britain, Trump himself, of course, very well disposed towards Britain, but partly because of the chaotic nature of the Trump administration, partly because of the chaotic nature of Brexit, we missed it, but it was mostly because of a sort of repulsion among the kind of British political and diplomatic class towards Team Trump. I remember speaking to Stephen Bannon about this, and he said he found it extraordinary how obviously disgusted they were by every official they met and the sort of nervousness of Brits towards Trump world. And then obviously that opportunity was missed, the beautiful, beautiful trade deal. You know, we can argue about whether Trump was sincere about that. I think he sort of half was, like he always is. But that opportunity has been missed. And so we move on to Biden, who, it's again no secret, is no great fan of Britain. Certainly his administration isn't. And I think possibly we can exaggerate slightly when we talk about how hostile Biden is, you know, his Irishness and so on. I think really it's more a kind of innate suspicion of Brexit among his administration, Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, and so on. They just don't like Brexit Britain, and they're hostile towards it. Of course, we had this Atlantic declaration with Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden. It was meant to be a kind of coming together moment, but it was a load of rubbish, really, I think. It just reiterated things that we already do, like share intelligence. Although, that said, I think there is something that Rishi Sunak's pushing on a lot, which could turn out to be very important, which is artificial intelligence and establishing an important relationship with the US on artificial intelligence. And of course, there's the shared commitment to Ukraine that will carry on and sort of bind the two countries together for as long as we're willing to throw money at that problem. And then, so, well, given that there's another election in November, I think let's think a little bit first about what happens if Trump wins, which at the moment it looks like he might. And then you have, this is where the special relationship will come in, special relationship unit will come in very useful, because you will have a second Trump administration and probably a Labour government, let's be honest. And I think one of the funniest things I find in British politics at the moment is David Lammy frantically trying to suck up to American politicians and Trump world after he called Donald Trump a KKK sympathiser. So that will be hilarious, no matter what. And I think we could probably conclude that, you know, whether Biden or Trump wins, Trump would be better for the special relationship, I would say. We can maybe argue about that. And so, therefore, we move on to the question, which is probably the more exciting question at the moment, which is Trump going to win or not? And I think I'll get Tom in on that quite a lot, because it's my policy at the moment is, if I think the person wants Biden to win, I say I think Donald Trump's going to win. And then if I think they're big Trumpy, I say, oh, I think Biden's going to nab it, just because I quite like annoying people. And I also, I told someone on Saturday night, got them very upset, saying I thought Biden was actually going to sneak it. So I think I'm going to say today that I think Donald Trump is going to win. And I think there are two main reasons why Donald Trump is going to win. One is his diversifying coalition. This has been talked about a lot, you've probably heard about it. People always said that Donald Trump is the, you know, harbinger of the angry white working class. In fact, increasingly, he's just a harbinger of a multiracial angry working class. And that's also why you see Trump doing very well in the Sun Belt. He's, according to that New York Times New York Times poll last week, he's miles ahead in some of the Sun Belt states, and with young voters too, of course. And I think another reason why he's doing so well in the South and not so well in those Great Lakes states is because of immigration. And I think people overlook that factor about this US election at their peril. We have record levels of illegal immigration in America. It's an enormous crisis. It bothers people of all races. And when they hear Trump talking about mass deportations, every time the media scream about that, his polls go up. People want mass deportations. Americans do, particularly in the South. Also energy, I think we'll talk about that a bit, but I think Trump's stress on energy is really important to why people like him and his willingness to drill. Against that, I would say that Joe Biden could win those swing states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. The polling's very tight there, and I think it's interesting, again, Tom will be better on this than me, but I think it's interesting that this is probably the first time we talk about Trump as a front-runner in a presidential election. And I think some of the pollsters I've spoken to say they're worried that whereas they've always underestimated Trump's support before, I think now they're tending to overestimate it a bit. So that's quite an interesting dynamic. But of course, if Biden does win, and this is something I find fascinating, given that he is the second Catholic president of the United States and a practicing Catholic who prays the rosary and so on, he will win because he is radically pro-abortion, and so is his party. And that is an election winner in some states. And it's very interesting the way that issue has flipped ever since Dobbs, which was the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Normally, Republicans could sort of talk cant about how they're pro-life without ever intending on changing the law in America, and they could rally the pro-life base. Now, Democrats can do exactly the same. They can rally the pro-abortion base quite easily, and it is a very, very powerful thing. We've seen it in special elections since Dobbs. We've seen it in the midterms. There is a very, very significant number of people who will vote Democrat because of abortion. And Republicans overlook that at their peril. And so it will ultimately boil down to the economy. And the economy, the Team Biden has thought for a long time that the economy will turn out to be in their favor, that these macro numbers, unemployment, so on, they're all looking really good for America. Wages are going up, all looking really good for America. I'd say that's falling flat a little bit, and it's partly because voters don't feel richer, and voters very often say, polls suggest, that voters mostly, on the whole, feel that they were much better off under Donald Trump. And if Trump wins the election, it'll be because of that. And then finally, before I go on to our panel, I'd say that the Democrats might just steal it again, which is what they did 4 years ago. That's a joke. That's a joke. I shouldn't say that. Sorry. Badly timed joke. Let me introduce our panel. Tom Lubbock will be our first speaker. He is one of the founding partners of JL Partners, a new polling firm who are doing extraordinary work on both sides of the Atlantic. And Tom is an expert on American government and political institutions. So Tom's going to talk to us a lot about the polls and perhaps a little bit about how that affects the special relationship. Second speaker will be Sarah Elliott, who probably needs no introduction, but I think we call you Lady Elliott of Micklefell, don't we? It says it right there, actually. She is the head of the Special Relationship Unit here at Legatum and has spent the past 20 years working in US politics, advocating for policies that encourage economic prosperity and preserve individual freedom. And then lastly, we'll hear from Christopher Butler, who is Executive Director of Americans for Tax Reform and the Tholos Foundation. And Americans for Tax Reform is probably the leading force for free market causes all over the world, but especially in America. So thank you very much for all of the three of you for joining us. And Tom, I'll start with you. Tell us about the polls.
Thanks, Freddy. I don't know how we get the true answer out of you in terms of who you think is going to win. It's like some kind of Alice in Wonderland problem. I have to tell you Biden if I want you to tell me the real answer, or like. But there's a really, really interesting kind of irony that's been lost in this, in the debate about the US election so far. And it's that the one person that Biden looks like most in terms of his polling numbers, his approval rating, if you look at his trajectory over the course of his presidency, what is the one president that Joe Biden looks most like? It's Donald Trump. It's the Donald Trump presidency that mirrors Joe Biden's almost exactly in terms of approval numbers. And ironically, Biden is actually behind Trump in terms of approval ratings, only because Trump actually, and this is often forgotten, got a kind of bounce from COVID. There was a kind of initial Trump bounce from COVID. And the takeaway, if you look at these approval ratings, and I have to say, I recommend 538's comparison of American presidencies and their approval ratings. The modern American presidency of Trump, now of Biden, of Obama second term, is a kind of pancake theory of approval. There's no high point. There's just no peaks. There's nothing that any of these presidents have done to make the American public sit up and go, yeah, I like that guy. Yeah, he's doing stuff for me. And thus has been the story of Joe Biden. And that is why he will, I think, he will be Bidened. He will be Bidened by Trump in the same way as Trump was Bidened by Biden in 2020. An unpopular incumbent, hasn't done things to deliver, hasn't delivered on the Americans' priorities, hasn't got the economy going in the right direction. Quite easy to pick off in the end. Close election, 2020, but was quite easy for Biden to pick Trump off. And this time round, it's looking like a kind of flip, a kind of mirror of what happened last time. It's quite extraordinary. And I think that kind of irony has been slightly lost in the debate so far. Big picture. On the very nitty-gritty, if you get down to the numbers, there are kind of 4 numbers that I've picked out that I think are really important. The first one, and I think this is the one you should watch, is Biden's approval. It's 16.5 points underwater at the moment, which is pretty much the worst of any presidency at this point in the cycle. Jimmy Carter, I think, was perhaps a bit worse, but he had a bit because this is now a kind of pancake. Carter had more variance, more ups and downs, and pretty much in the modern presidency, Biden is at the bottom of the league table. So I think that's one to watch. It hasn't been going in the direction Democrats wanted. There was a kind of blip around the State of the Union, but it wasn't sustained, and it returned back to this kind of minus 16.5 level. So pretty poor for Biden. And then American politics is absolutely fascinating in terms of polling, because in some ways it is the most polled polity in the world, probably by a long chalk. But in terms of having good time series, good numbers, and I think as Freddy said, we're new to this game, so we haven't got the kind of 20-year, 30-year time series here. But in terms of time series, looking over time, it's actually way easier to look at British politics than it is to look at American politics. And so I think that's what often makes people looking at the polling quite confused about what's going to happen. And in British politics, what we have is these long time series looking at the things that actually move the dial, the things that actually change voters' mind, rather than the outcome, is someone doing well or badly, is a prime minister doing well or badly. And the things that move the dial in modern politics are strong. Is a leader viewed as strong? Are they mentally capable, particularly in this latest US race? And do they get things done? And on those 3 numbers, which I think you would pick out of kind of series of attributes, Trump is ahead of Biden 51-37 on strong, 46-25 on mentally strong, and 51-40 on gets things done. And when we put to voters, what are the 3 things that you're looking for in a president, those 3 actually come top. And that is a terrible position for Biden to be in. Trump is in majority, we call this kind of attribute ownership. And Trump is actually in a majority position on strong, and a plurality position on mentally strong, and another majority on gets things done. And it's very, very hard to overturn that kind of position. So extremely, extremely worrying territory if you're a Biden supporter. And then there's this paradox around the huge legal jeopardy that Democrats think Trump faces. And on the one hand, it's impossible to not, in some sense, throw your hands up and say anything could, in theory, happen. And I think, Freddie, you made that quite clear in what you said. You know, we could wake up on the first Tuesday in November, and Trump blew up in August, or he was found guilty in the Manhattan DA case and just tailed off from there. But I think what's actually more likely is that people are not, and we've got evidence to show this, people are not actually paying attention to this first Manhattan DA case. So we asked people, how much attention are you paying? And only 13% of the American public are paying close attention to the case. And there's an irony in that. It's a kind of paradox, because this is the one case that is going to be heard, and sequencing matters. And this is the one, I think, that is going to frame the rest of that legal jeopardy that Trump faces. And so there's a huge, huge opportunity for Trump here if he is, in fact, acquitted, or, as is more likely, if the jury is hung. If he can establish that as his kind of first point in the legal calendar, I think that will set the tone for everything else that comes, given the fact that so few Americans are actually interested in the nuts and bolts of these trials. So there's that kind of paradox around Trump and the trials. People aren't paying attention, but there are black swan events could come out of this process. And then there's the kind of issue landscape that we're facing. I think you're right, Freddie, that immigration is absolutely central to this race, and I think it will come back. But we're in this kind of hiatus period at the moment where inflation has actually reared its head again in the eyes of the American public. And that is the top issue, has been the top issue neck and neck with immigration in the last couple of months, but it's just now pulled ahead again of immigration, and immigration has tailed off slightly. And so it's this toxic inflation that has poisoned the leadership of every single incumbent leader in democratic states around the world. Trudeau, Albanese, Sunak, you name them. Anyone who was in office this time last year has been poisoned by inflation. And the big question is, how fast does that poison get out of the system? And all the evidence on both sides of the Atlantic is that for voters, it's a slow-acting poison, and it just kind of ratchets up. There's no end to it. Prices don't come down. People think of themselves as poorer, and once they think of themselves as poorer, once you go into kind of Walmart and everything's twice the price it used to be, it's hard to shift that dynamic 6 months out from an election. And even if the headline numbers do turn good, there's actually very strong academic evidence that economic perceptions 6 months before an election are more predictive of the outcome rather than economic perceptions just before polling day. And I think if you came to hear me talk about the ins and outs of the special relationship, you're going to be really disappointed, because that mostly amounts to me just throwing my hands up and going, why are you making me wait in a long line at Dulles what is 4 o'clock in the morning UK time when I just need to go to bed? So, I mean, I can chip in later, but Sarah's going to know much more about this than me and Chris. But the polling evidence from the UK is still pretty unambiguous on Trump versus Biden. So it's about half, 55% of the UK public say that they want Biden to win, but only 15% say they want Trump to win. And there's been no kind of warming up to Trump at all. There hasn't been that kind of forgetting that seems to have taken place amongst large chunks of the US public in terms of what that Trump administration was like. And on the face of it, the British public also say that Trump would be worse for all aspects of British foreign policy than Biden. But I would just add this one caveat, and it's the last thing I'll say. I think a Trump victory is priced in UK voters' minds. And so that shock factor isn't going to be there in the same way as it was last time. And that is really going to help. I think there'll be a grudging acceptance by the UK public, and that will certainly help with what follows with the special relationship. If it's Keir Starmer having to run that gauntlet, tread that kind of tightrope, he will have more room for manoeuvre than last time round, I think.
Thank you very much, Tom. Sarah, you tell us a bit about the special relationship.
Well, it's still going.
Yeah.
We still meet. No, it's a funny time because I feel like in this election year we haven't had many surprises, and I know that you've lamented this on Americana, which I highly recommend everyone to listen to, the Freddy's podcast on American politics, and it's kind of predictable. I think in this country we've settled that Labor's going to win. It's just a matter by how much. At least that's in people's minds at the moment. And in America, we're increasingly going, we think Trump actually has this. The wind is at Trump's back. There's huge enthusiasm gaps between for the Biden people. There's higher enthusiasm for Trump. This new New York Siena poll just came out last week that said that never Bidens are at 52%, higher than the never Trump, which is at like 40-something%. So it's kind of, people are kind of like, you know what, I think this guy is going to pull it off. And that's just the feeling. Now, it's a coin toss. The swing states will determine it. A lot can happen between now and Election Day. But because that is kind of fermenting in people's minds, you have the Labour Party speaking incredibly diplomatically for them, particularly David Lammy, as we've pointed out, who called Donald Trump a Nazi, KKK, misogynistic sympathizer. And yet he was speaking at the Hudson Institute about 10 days ago and was saying, I actually agree with Donald Trump's putting pressure on NATO countries to up their defense spending. And, I like J.D. Vance's ideas on trade. And, that J.D. Vance. And you kind of start thinking, I think David Lammy thinks he's going to be the VP nod, I think. And then you have this Utah, or I think he was Idaho, senator, Republican, agreeing with Mr. Lammy at this talk, and it was a very new type of Labour Party. And you also had members go to the Heritage Foundation to talk about a free trade agreement, along with British American Business, the City Corp of London, the British Embassy. But it was at the Heritage Foundation, who in Labour's mind think is running the Project 2025 and Trump's possible transition team. And there were some differences on trade and messaging, but there was an agreement that something could get done, that what the Conservatives were not able to do under a very friendly Trump administration, that actually it's going to be Keir Starmer of the Labour Party that's going to get something done with the big orange angry man in the White House. And so it will show competency for Labour. And Labour will come out as the one who was able to get things done that 14 years of a Conservative government could not. And I think, as free marketers, we need to take Labour's olive branches seriously. We need to take them seriously as they are likely to be the ones in power, and they're starting to act like it. I've had conversation just last week with a prominent Labour MP who was like, listen, Trump's going to get it, isn't it? It's going to be Trump. And I was like, and what are you going to do about it? How are you going to act? And she said, well, we have to think of the office. We have to think of the office. And I'm like, absolutely right. And I don't think it really matters who is president or prime minister with this special relationship. It will remain because of national security interests at the base level. I mean, we share intelligence with each other that the other members of the Five Eyes do not receive. Clearly, in a post-Brexit world, we were able to form AUKUS, the nuclear submarine pact, which is growing and hopefully will include Canada and Japan soon. The two of us, the two countries, the Americans and the Brits, definitely lead the way on many things. And I think the Brits are going to find it very frustrating to try to do any further deals with the EU. I think what we have with them will remain, and that the opportunities are going to be across the Atlantic. So regardless of who's in power, I think there will be efforts to get something done. I have been told by Trump transition officials that a free trade agreement or a trade agreement in the first 100 days is a top priority. So it's a top priority for both sides. And they're not looking so much as to a separate bilateral agreement as it is, let's look at maybe adding the UK to the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, which of course was renegotiated under Trump and received bipartisan support. So that could be an easy way in which we increase foreign direct investment, trade, maybe increase some work visas, which I'm sure we all would like to see, be able to work in each other's countries, stay longer, maybe get fast-tracked through Dulles, who knows. And Heathrow's not any better.
No.
So I think there is opportunity to work with. We need to remain optimistic. In a Biden administration, he has completely shut down any sort of trade agreement with the UK, but it's not just the UK. He shut trade agreements down across the board. It is not a priority. That is very odd. Most presidents and executives like to lead with that. They like to see, that they're doing business around the world. And not the case with this president. And he obviously has created a lot of fires across the world, literally. So his hands are full. But I'm optimistic about moving forward and what can be achieved, especially because Labor and Trump have similar outlook on trade. And both, by the way, have agreed that trade with allies is a priority. So whereas they may not be free market with everyone, as Dr. Orr said up here, it's maybe not the best idea to do free trade with China, who is an active adversary right now. But it does make sense to have free trade with allies. So I think that's basically where things stand at the moment. And lots to be seen. If you all want to know when the key returns come in here in the UK, you need to be awake around 3 to 5 a.m. on post-election day, just to get the returns in real time.
And don't go on the Today program and say that you think Trump's won it, which is what I did about 6:30 in the morning, which is a big mistake. But Christopher, you take us away, focusing on trade, please.
Yeah, sure. If I'll just make one quick point on the election, which is that I think ought to be pointed out, which is the intense base differences that the Democrats and the Republicans are experiencing in the run-up to the election. We use HarrisX internally for doing most of our polling, and Harris has had a Trump up 5% nationally the other day, just as a footnote. But I spoke to him, our lead pollster, during the during the twilight of Nikki Haley's presidential primary challenge. And my question was, is there anything possible way that she could pull this off? And he said, no, there's not. It's over. There's nothing that can be done. And our polling showed 6 months ago that there was nothing to be done that could be done to stop Trump. And I said, oh, well, so he's likely to lose in the general then. He said, no, we think he'll also win in the general. I said, oh, that's interesting, given all this. And this was sort of at the nadir for Trump when he was facing all these indictments and everything, first documents case. And he says, that because there's 22 million people in this country that will turn out and vote for Donald Trump, and they will vote for no one else. They will not go to the polls for any other Republican. They don't care. If they're turned out by Trump to the election, to the polls, they'll vote for every Republican that happens to be sitting there. But they won't go if Trump's not on the ballot. And that's what happened in 2022 when Republicans underperformed. Is the polling showed that these people were there and they could be turned out, but Republicans just we hold the House by one seat now, solely, and didn't win the Senate, solely because those 22 million people didn't turn out to vote for Donald Trump. And I think that's important when you look at what the composition of Congress is going to be. I think that if Trump does win the presidency, he drags the House along with him with somewhere between a 6 to 8 seat majority in the House. I think the Senate looks like it has from 52 to 53 Republicans in it. And that means that they can, and Trump would desire to have enhanced trade negotiation status, which is something that Biden hasn't enjoyed, and Republican president hasn't enjoyed for quite some time. And so that will make a big difference, both because because Trump has to, assuming he's elected, he'll be renegotiating USMCA, regardless, as Sarah mentioned, and there will be a number of other bilateral trade agreements that he would be interested in. In working with the administration, we found almost a complete lack of interest in any multilateral trade agreements last time, with the exception of what became the USMCA, strictly and almost completely because NAFTA was there and we had to do something with NAFTA. So I don't think that there's any opportunity to do any multilateral trade agreements, but as we've all said, there's a strong interest in doing something with the UK. So we are optimistic there. And the part that is probably a little bit more disheartening is a little bit change in the direction of Republican elected officials and how generally favorable they are toward trade, and how much there is growing within certain parts of the American right, although it's small, but there is this rethinking of to what degree should Republicans be aligned with trade unions and the trade unions' motivations. And even more than Biden's 1916 view of the world on Ireland is being a factor, I think that the biggest thing is or one of the other biggest things is his complete devotion to traditional Democrat trade union politics. In many ways, Joe Biden doesn't run anything. The reason his administration is so far to the left is that whoever is most interested in a given policy area has complete and total ability to do that because he's so absent as a leader. But the one exception to that is on labor policy. There's nobody that could come into the Biden administration and tell him about labor policy. It's why he makes this so much of a priority for his administration. It's why he was so heavily motivated in unionizing the BMW plant in Chattanooga 2 weeks ago, the first United Auto Workers organization of a American automaker in the South, outside of the Rust Belt, and so there is this slight building of labor, and there are unfortunately some Republicans like J.D. Vance who are flirting a little bit with this, and hopefully we can kind of get them back on a little bit better path, but that presents some challenges.
Great. Well, thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Sarah. I think we're running a bit tight on time, so I will just ask you one fairly quick question each, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. Sarah, I thought I'd start by asking you about, assuming the Tory party get a real wipeout at the next election, or a very serious heavy defeat, which looks very likely. I wanted to ask you about what you think the relationship between the Tory party and the Trump right will become, because you could see the Tory party gravitating right, which would, you'd think, be good for relations between Team Trump and the Tories, or you could be left with a kind of rump of centrist Tory MPs who find it all a bit disgusting. Which way do you think it's going to go?
I think a lot depends on what Nigel Farage decides to do, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Does he join the Tories? Does he run independently, reform? I think if there's a huge wipeout of the Tories, it's a real rebuilding moment for the party, and they may decide to, rethink things. And go back to their base or to the roots and be more Thatcher-like as a party, in which case I think you could see them reaching out to the Republicans and being friendly again. I think if it's a minor defeat or not as grand as everyone's anticipating, the centrists will, say, well, we really weren't that far off. It was just a bad year. It's been 14 years, the pendulum swung, and we lost. And so maybe they won't. A lot of I have heard that a lot of the MPs around the cabinet table feel a greater threat from Lib Dems in their districts than from reform, and hence their policy has reflected this more center-leftist vibe, and they haven't really kind of gotten to the program until now. But my hope is that they will stay open-minded to Republicans regardless, and everybody rises to the occasion and act like adults, because America is the superpower of the world, and we must condemn mass protests and big orange balloons in our city when the President of the United States comes. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I have a feeling if Labour's in power, Sadiq will probably behave himself a bit more and won't permit it. But we shall see. I think it will depend on how big the majority is.
That's very optimistic, particularly on Sadiq, I think. But thank you very much, Sarah. Tom, I hear a lot of talk when I do the podcast, a lot of polls and things talking about we now have election seasons. We don't have election days because of all the mail-in voting and so on. And in fact, months away, the election is already sort of happening. How does this affect this particular race?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very unusual season in that the debates have now moved to the earliest first debate ever and the earliest last debate ever. So you will have a debate between Trump and Biden, by the looks of things, on the 27th of June, which is unprecedented. And the debate tends not to shift things too much, but it is a moment. The key thing to remember is it's when a lot of voters will start to pay attention in a way that they just have not paid attention to Trump or Biden in the last three and a half years. And so, I mean, it will be absolutely pivotal that it's so early. 70 million watched the Trump-Biden debate last time compared to something like 23 million watched the Super Bowl. It is the biggest TV event in the American calendar, and it will be important for focusing minds, if nothing else. I do think it will also be really important because the fundamentals are at stake here for these two candidates. It's not, if you had a generic Republican and a generic Democrat debating, I think a score draw is the most likely outcome in the US at the moment. But because Biden's mental acuity and because Trump's temper and his temperament is in question, I think you will see that debate mattering perhaps in a way that sometimes it hasn't in the past. So the debate's absolutely vital. I don't think the conventions will make any difference. And yeah, don't take anything too literally till Labour Day.
And Christopher, I think have you read this book Vassal State by Angus Hunton?
I haven't.
Oh, well, no reason to really. But it's sorry, he's a very nice guy, and it's quite an interesting book. So yes, do read it. Is what I mean to say. It's about the way that the US has essentially taken over the British economy, and I was instinctively opposed to his thesis, but I found myself being quite well won over by it. And I think a lot of British people feel that way about trade between the US and the UK, that it tends to be the US buying up Britain, and that if you go into a supermarket, everything you buy is probably ultimately owned by an American company. Private equity, hedge funds and so on, American companies have huge power in Britain, dominant power in Britain, in fact, and also cash transactions. Every card transaction is being controlled by America. A little bit of money goes towards America. How do you think free trade Americans should address that skepticism? And if there is to be a beautiful, beautiful trade deal between Trump's America and Britain, what do you think could be said to Brits who are anxious about this American dominance of the UK economy? And the answer can't just be, would you rather be ruled by China? Would you rather be owned by China? Because lots of Brits say, well, no, we'd rather be owned by Britain.
Well, I guess there are two different options if you're concerned about slipping behind in ways like that, which is that you can erect barriers and try to subsidize, like the EU has done on things like the DMC and DMA, where they tax and control and moderate like the giant American tech companies. I mean, you can do things like that, or you can do, and unfortunately the UK is looking at doing a similar kind of thing with the DMCC. There are these kinds of ways that are not formal trade activities, but there are ways that the EU, for example, is clearly targeting the largest American firms and the largest American companies. And you see, meanwhile, you see that domestic innovation and domestic efficiency degrades, and so you're getting this cycle of raising these controls in this regulatory environment on the others to match this declining scenario that's going on. And now that the UK has gone through Brexit, there's the opportunity to take the reverse engagement course. And I would suggest that that's the best way to proceed, to try to import some of that innovation and liberalized markets. I mean, we have a lot that we need to do on our side too. I mean, in an idealized environment, you're going to force us to liberalize our financial sector in a way that we really need to do in order to become more competitive. It's one of the few countries that the U.S. has the free trade agreement with, in Japan, which forced us to liberalize a lot of this sector when we entered into that free trade agreement. And if it's structured the right way, it would help both of us in that way to liberalize our economies.
Thank you. We are running low on time, so we will take some questions, please, if anybody has any. One at the back there.
Hi, it's just a general question to the panel. To what extent does the Israel-Palestine issue sort of suppress Biden's, sort of youth turnout, and how that is going to affect the election generally?
Tom, I think you've probably done some polling on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things here. I think it just takes their attention away from. I think that, there was a big Axios piece last week saying that they're polling deniers, but I actually think they're quite plugged in, and they are trying to fix, the Biden team are trying to fix these fundamental problems they've got, hence the debates that have now been agreed to. But the problem is that they are just flailing around on so many of these issues, Israel, Gaza being one of them. It just takes the inertia out of any attempt to kind of fix the fundamental problems he's got. But one of the fundamental problems is this sense of just, despair amongst the American youth that, there's no good answer now for Biden on that, I don't think. They have set this in motion, and everything they do seems to make it worse. So their only hope is that somehow attention is turned off between now and November, but it seems unlikely, and I think it will factor really quite strongly.
You want to add to that?
The New York Siena poll, which I quoted earlier, has come out and said that generally the Gaza-Israeli issue is just 2% of an issue. I mean, 2% of the population care about it, but Biden is losing 13% of support, especially among people who rank this higher. But then he's also losing about 16% of more conservative, moderate Dems on this issue as well. So he's not pleasing either side.
I'd also add to that RFK Jr., if RFK Jr. was a great anti-Israel speaker, then you might see more of a bleed away from Biden. But he's been very pro-Israel, and so that's not going to be a significant factor. But I do think it is a big problem for Biden, particularly in Michigan, with its large proportion of Arab voters. You wanted to go next. Sorry, the lady here.
Thank you. Claire Cummings from the Centre for Digital Assets and Democracy. Lady Elliott, I was just wondering, you were talking about the free trade agreement between the US and UK, yet Trump in the past has been rather more protectionist in his policies. Is this something which is specific to the UK, or is he as a whole moving more towards free trade and Ricardian economics?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the day you meet him or find him. But in general, he has a very special place for the UK. Of course, his mother was Scottish. He loved the Queen. He did 2 state visits here in his last administration, more than any other country. I think he's very up for making a deal, and he always starts in like the worst position to work back in deal making. That's kind of his modus operandi. I mean, the rumor for Treasury Secretary is Bob Lighthizer, who is not a very big free trader, but I think they do generally agree with the concept of trade with allies and free trade with allies. So I think we shouldn't write them off yet. Be aware that they have thrown these statements out there, but I think there is room to maneuver.
Christopher, do you want to add?
I would say he views a lot of these tariffs as an instrument to another end. So rather than being actively anti-free trade, I mean, at least him personally, he wants to raise these barriers for the purposes of tearing them down. I mean, there's very little that a president can do completely unilaterally in terms of formulating policy like this, economic policy. But he has a very wide latitude on what he can do with tariffs. And that's a big part of why he likes them.
I think we've got to stop it there, but thank you very much, all three of you. You've been very insightful.